Good morning. We are here to introduce the Sentience product founded on the Neo4j platform. Sentience is part of a London business incubator, B2B incubator called SeedCloud, formed by myself and Lee Burgess as we left HP with the partners of Notion Capital, who had sold Message Labs for a $700 million exit. So a strong pedigree of enterprise sales access and B2B background in our business, basically. Just very quickly, Phil, how do I work your laptop, by the way? That's the first question. Just click. Good. Why is it frozen? Presenting with me today is Phil Harvey, who is both the CTO of Datashaker, a SeedCloud member company, and holds the title of SeedCloud Evangelist, which means that Phil is basically talking to a number of large enterprises about the future of enterprise data and how they wish to reshape data in this fast-changing, contextually driven data world. And the rest of our team, by the way, are here in the audience. By the way, František and Stefano and Lee are here from Sentience as well to ask questions after the event, if that helps at all. The business problem that Sentience is addressing is one that I hope everyone here has encountered and recognizes in their business environment, which is namely that in a large or even medium-sized enterprise, you are setting out to find information about a specific topic that might affect your next 2 hours' work. An example of that is I want to find information on who has used graph databases in production in our current enterprise. And I start, of course, typically by searching the inbox, because that provides me with the most contextually relevant trail of information about the use of that graph database, the experts surrounding that, and the business context in which that product was used. So typically a user starts in the inbox, searches silos like SharePoint, and then turns outside to the web, whereupon there is no filter for the flood of information that person is facing on that subject. And I'll return to that graph database search as a perfect example later in the presentation, how Sentience was born. So the fact is most users are failed by the limitation of the tools we have, which are primarily search-based tools, fundamentally. The inbox is driven by search. You're searching Yammer, you're driven by search, but also by the limitations of the search terms that you use. Whether you're searching for Neo versus Mongo, or whether you're searching on a term like enterprise graph. Now that term will bring up thousands of irrelevant results about pie graphs, line graphs, pie charts, nothing to do with the graph technology you're searching on. Or an example when we're working in the airline space was the term CRM, which brought up information about crew resource management rather than the Salesforce system. So the context of that search is quite important. So I think, sorry, Phil.
If you drop down to filing system searches, for example, you're going to use a basic search tool on keywords such as that, and you're going to wade through a huge number of documents that are now out of context.
Yes.
The inbox contains the content of that information. Your filing system probably doesn't.
Absolutely. There's no metadata about those documents contained in that filing system. So is this really the age of productivity and collaboration? I spend probably 2 hours a day myself filtering the increasing information thrown at me. Every new tool that promises productivity and collaboration just delivers an additional stream of information for me to filter through. So it's increasing noise, I would suggest, across the enterprise. The example anecdote was Lee and I used to work for HP, and we, of course, are not referring to Hewlett-Packard in this presentation, obviously, about a large global IT company with nearly 400,000 employees. Is not referring to HP, I must, of course, stress. And we were searching for information on graph databases at that point in time. And this was 2011, before graph databases was a term that was used consistently in the public domain. So what we did was we started a search. We started with the inbox. We moved to people that we perceived to be domain experts. We contacted divisions in the company. We made phone calls. And that research resulted in no expertise in the whole company on graph databases. 4 months later, while sitting in a French office, someone said, were you aware that Alexandre, 4 desks away, has won awards for his work on graph databases? At this point in time, the penny dropped. We didn't know, but the enterprise did know. There was a layer of information in that enterprise that contained that knowledge. So the enterprise had the knowledge. It wasn't returning to the people that needed the knowledge at the right time, basically. And we realized that maybe we could do something about this. So this is the time at which the idea of sentience was literally born. Could we create a tool that would use the power of a graph database to map all this information and provide a single set of corporate memory that learned as the enterprise progressed in different trajectories across different parts of the enterprise? So what Sentience basically, which by the way is already in production and in trials with an early client, but is undergoing ongoing development. What it's fundamentally doing is, first of all, if you look at emails, chats, documents across the enterprise, it is using traditional NLP techniques to extract topics from that information. Where it can, it's using semi-structured ontologies. If there is an ontology on Wikipedia or in a domain like investment technology for industry, we'll use that, but it's not relying on those. And then it's adding, using the web as a reinforcement for its learning. It's crawling the web to reinforce its learning about domains of knowledge, about topics within those domains, and also it's carrying out a number of techniques to verify that neo-technology is a company, that Phil Harvey is related to SeedCloud. It's verifying entities via that web crawling. And that is a continuous cycle. So it essentially is a self-learning system where we're using the graph as a machine learning platform, but actually perhaps more fundamentally, the graph itself is a learning system as well. I think it's important to stress. The graph itself is learning as well as us using the graph for a machine learning platform. That's a good summary. So, moving on to our view. Our view is that the most important asset in any organization is the knowledge it contains. Whether that organization is an IT company or an offshore oil and gas company, the value of the enterprise is hidden in those sets of knowledge within that business. So moving over to Phil to talk about knowledge.
That's exactly right. Knowledge is the most important strategic asset that your business has. Now, knowledge itself has a whole area of philosophy dedicated to it. This is known as the philosophy of epistemology. It's the philosophy of what you know and how you know it. Now, business epistemology, as fancy as it sounds, exists right now, and it's evolving. And it's evolving in a key way based on the data available to the organization. Originally, companies had an introspective epistemology. This meant that the data they generated themselves from their activities was all they used to understand the world in which they operated. Then, companies started to do things like market research and started to buy data sets in, very specifically to support the investigations they were doing, the way they wanted to understand the world. This often led to confirmation bias, where you go, let's go and ask these people these questions to find out what they think of us. Now we know more. As recently as from 2010, the environment has opened up to the business. And you can now be completely interactive with your understanding. The availability of data that describes the actions that you take is freely available in the world. You can do everything from sensing floor panels that tell you how people walk around in your shop and how your displays laid out exist, all the way through to social media and understanding the conversations about your organization. You can fully interact with your environment and understand what you know from that perspective.
If you look at perhaps a model a decade ago, an enterprise would have a large monolithic OLAP-style warehouse that they would query for a set of results, typically overnight in an ETL process, resulting in a cube-like view of their data. Whereas that model is changing towards, I need contextual information right now to assist me to make decisions live on the project I'm working on at this very moment in time. And then I could do with revising those actions based upon new incoming data in a sort of rolling loop, a feedback loop. That is the complete change in the introspection to interactivity model.
So the OLAP example is great because what happened in those scenarios is systems where you designed up front the schema and the bounds of knowledge that allowed your employees to look at meant that you had to know up front what they were going to be asking for. There was no sense of short-term evolution from in an hourly basis, if you will. Now, the study of knowledge itself and the study of business epistemology exists. In organizations, it exists as a field known as knowledge management. This has been around for a long time, and one of the pivotal papers in the field of knowledge management is by Ikejiro Nonaka, a Japanese business philosopher who discussed how organizations and people work together to generate and manage knowledge. He discusses everything from knowledge being generated in a shared context through to the idea of how you share tacit knowledge, that thing you know that makes you good at your job, but you don't know how you know it. So the idea of apprenticeships and training and observation and these things comes out of that. Now, sadly, and this is something I find very depressing, is the theory is fantastic. The technology that was generated because of this, not so good. There was a big wave of intranets and company wikis that were generated off the back of this theory. Sadly, in most organizations I've seen, those are the places where knowledge goes to die. Things get forgotten, they don't get updated. It's entirely based on the users themselves filling that knowledge in.
Well, so, example is a multinational corporation that recently built a intranet to register expertise for all their employees. The person who'd done that was the person who built the intranet, registered his expertise in building intranets in the first place. So, and it had not progressed beyond that because, again, it was designed up front and human curated, basically.
Exactly, and so you have this layer of expectations built up through knowledge management, and you now have a completely different set of tools where that knowledge is shared and interacted with. Everything from the filing system and email that Graham mentioned earlier, all the way through to Dropbox and Box, SharePoint, and now you can interact with all of these things right now, on your phone, on your tablet. So all of this knowledge is being shared and moved around, and you don't say, I've now looked this up, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the iPad, I'm going to log into the internet, and I'm going to write down that I now know this. That's not the way it works. It's on the fly. We live in an interruption situation where I'm looking, and now I'm looking at that over there. I'm not going to take the time to update it myself.
The other change in that pattern is maybe a decade ago, the majority of enterprise data was transactional data, OLTP, OLAP. The majority is now textual. There's been a strong shift towards the vast body being a textual base of the information.
And all of that text stored in these silos offers a search functionality. So what that's asking a user to do is to dig. You have to dig out that data. You have to dig out the information you want. You have to know the search terms, or at least the lingua franca, if you will, of what you're looking for. If you don't even know that, there's nowhere to start, so you can't find it.
It's horribly recursive.
Yes, I don't know what Graham's talking about, and I don't know how to ask to find out.
Exactly.
So
precisely, yeah.
Yes, it's difficult for me, and the systems don't help. Now, one of the reasons for this is the way that a lot of those systems are designed. You take a piece of text, a nice quote, thanks to Lee for that from the Hitchhiker's Guide, and you squash it into an artificial shape. That could be a schema, a rectangle that you've designed up front. Knowledge doesn't exist like that. Knowledge exists like this. We think in graphs. And the reason I know this, and I can say this with confidence, is when I talk to people in large organizations, we have a conversation, and I go away and I map out in a graph-like way what that conversation looked like. You show that to the person you talk to, and they say, that's what it looks like in my head. I should have that tattooed on my back because that's what everybody says in those scenarios.
Virtually every business meeting you're in, they go to a whiteboard and they start drawing graph. I'm sure the same occurred in Deutsche Bank, Matt. They go to a whiteboard and they start drawing a graph to explain the problem, right? So this is very, very typical, this thinking and explaining in a graph view.
And there's a reason for that. If you study all the way that knowledge works, you start to see two ends of a spectrum. On the one hand, you have order. You have the idea of columns and rows and strictly designed things up front. And that order comes out of a necessity for control. On the other hand, you have the situation of total chaos in raw data. I've got these files in Dropbox, these in Box, this is in Slack, this is in that email. It's chaos. And what you need between those two is a balance. And that's what graph offers us in the way that we think when we start to draw it on the whiteboard and in technology. It's what's known as the chaotic balance. You maintain useful properties from chaos, the flexibility, the changeability, but you allow people to draw order from it. Graph is a fundamentally chaotic structure. Knowledge is the most valuable asset we have within business, and that is a chaotic asset. So if you use the right tools for holding that knowledge and giving people access to it, you keep its value and you keep it alive. Otherwise, you will squash that value out of the data you're working with.
Absolutely. So taking that chaotic theme, returning to how Sentience actually manages that chaotic model, it'd be nice to distinguish between the methods that are designed up front, is a phrase we've been using here, and indeed human curated, where the BBC Sports website's a great example of a subject, object, predicate kind of structure whereby you are describing the object relationship. That's fine for a very tight domain, like a sports-based consumer, a single consumer audience. Or you have more of an ontological view, which might be great in something like a bioinformatics space, where you have terminology that's unique to that space, and that terminology very rarely changes. However, we live in a world in tech where microservices emerges within a couple of years as a new area of research, and the terminology changes by the day in that domain. As we speak, someone's writing a blog, and there'll be a new piece of terminology attached to microservices. So what Sentience is doing is saying, I am actually learning the relationship between bounded context or stateless servers and microservices. And I am letting the phrase microservices become the apex of that. I'm learning that microservices is the key central domain here, the key topic. I'm discovering the context. I'm also discovering peripheral relationships, like the relationship of Docker, which is a product, to perhaps the stateless server model. So it basically is allowing the graph to self-learn based upon both the enterprise behavior and reinforcing that with external web behavior driven by current technology trends, using this example. And by the way, just to add that Sentience is actually doing its research in a domain-specific way, in that its web crawling is specific to the tech industry or the oil and gas industry in different focused locations on the web, basically. So that gives you the idea that really there is no design up front, no curation in this model. And what Sentience is then doing is self-organizing itself into these entity groups. So it's not a completely chaotic, unstructured graph with many connections. Sentience recognizes that neo-technology is a company and verifies that and puts that into its entity group of companies. Now, these relationships will change over time. There's a model of temporal decay in Sentience, because what is a company might get acquired by Apple, Foundation DB being a great example, and vanish off the market and become a product after a period of time. So recognizing the difference between those relationship changes is very, very key. But Sentience is also forming connections between entities across domains, and it's recognizing that I have a strong relationship to Phil in relation to the subject of the future of enterprise data or NoSQL or whatever else it might be. So it's building up cross-domain relationship strength, which will be very, very important. We move on to discovering content via related topics. I'm going to move on to next, is using both the domain and the related topic to get to the underlying content. So doing a worked example of a mythical agency working with consumer brands, perhaps focused on the automotive sector, they might have researchers who are regularly trying to find out where certain celebrities are interacting with certain brands, perhaps formally or informal affiliations, because that association will give that agency a view of where the audience affiliation has moved. If a celebrity, if David Beckham has moved his affiliation to a different brand, there's an audience that will follow that affiliation and therefore change their audience marketing strategy. Now, this kind of search at the moment might be done by simply combining a series of search terms and repeating those search terms over and over again to find the articles that highlight those recent changes in affiliation. Let's take a Sentience example. I'm going to give you a couple of Sentience example screens now, and I'll move on to the full visualization, by the way, in a second or two, but I'll just start with this, where you give Sentience a search term surrounding automotive and celebrity, and Sentience then discovers that the phrase brand ambassador is related to celebrity. Sentience has learned that relationship. Or Sentience has learned that the phrase superstar has an affiliation to celebrity. So the search term celebrity would have failed you on these documents, and yet Sentience has used that strongly related topic to lead you to that content. And so looking at, for instance, the example content of the Beckham becoming brand ambassador for a particular car brand, we can now see an example Sentience result of a piece of discovery via that technique. Now, what Sentience has done is said, I have a piece of content that I have discovered. Now, that might, in fact, be a document section, because documents are completely different in their profile throughout their entire length of the documents. That might be a single piece of a document, which Sentience has classified into the automotive sector, the style and design key topic underneath the automotive sector, and has formed a relationship to David Beckham, brand ambassador, and to Jaguar Land Rover. This release actually is about David Beckham becoming brand ambassador in China for Jaguar Land Rover. But it's also inferred a connection to BMW, Coventry, intriguingly, a connection to British style and elegance and Coventry there, Lee, which I think is an interesting bit of learning there. And then also to entities such as David Beckham and locations like China. So what this has done, basically, is self-learned all those affiliations and immediately unearthed a piece of content that the enterprise might never have discovered throughout repeated searches. Okay, so example use cases of a Sentience platform. Sentience effectively is an engine which is providing this self-learning knowledge graph. We have been exploring a number of use cases of Sentience, talking to a number of large enterprises about their different views of this problem. We have had conversations around document discovery. Our first customer actually is using it for research document discovery, expertise, location within the enterprise, personal network intelligence, increasingly talking to the financial community about market-facing intelligence based upon market sectors, companies, people, relationships to companies, and also the M&A world, where the due diligence phase when you're acquiring a company is a really difficult, short phase of wading through thousands of documents, where that kind of visualization could highlight risks for an acquirer in the M&A phase. So basically, Sentience is looking at commercializing a number of vertical market applications around the core Sentience engine. Phil, what have I missed there? With my voice failing.
So one of my favorite use cases here is around development work. My history is as a software engineer, and as well as skills discovery within an organization, you can also take your commit messages. You can take your code and your comments and all of these things to look at your code base in an entirely different way. And I'm sure there are lots of people here who've met the problems of duplication across teams, who've met the problems of not knowing who wrote what and why. Why was this algorithm changed? This can help. It's basically anywhere where you need to know something, where you think the organization holds that knowledge, but you don't know how to get at it, which happens all the time.
We're talking to a number of C-level execs who are saying the development team holds a layer of knowledge which DevOps don't share and the C-level execs don't share. Can Sentience help with that visibility of the signals of what's being worked on to kind of solve that transparency issue into the organization? So that's the summary. Now, moving on to why we chose Neo. I mean, František has kindly put down some technical points, which you can talk to František afterwards. But I would summarize it from a commercial perspective that There was the community around Neo, very important, the strong language support, the trajectory of releases, but perhaps the most important point was that Neo technology has an enterprise sales focus, and that aligns with Sentience. We wanted to align with a business that had a similar belief about the changing face of enterprise data, which was the foundation, the real foundation for our choice of Neo technology. So, if you do have any questions, feel free to use the email addresses listed to fire questions after the event. Thank you. Thanks all.